So tonight's Torah portion, we begin the book of Leviticus, the Torah portion of Vayikra. We'll begin with the Parsha overview, and then we will jump right into tonight's topic. In this week's Torah portion, Hashem calls Moshe from the tent of meeting and communicates to him the laws of the korbanot, the animal and meal offerings brought in the sanctuary. These include the ascending offering, Olah, that was wholly raised to Hashem by the fire atop the altar. Secondly, 5 varieties of meal offerings, in Hebrew, mincha, prepared with fine flour, olive oil, and frankincense. Thirdly, the peace offering, shlamim, whose meat was eaten by the one bringing the offering, after parts were burned on the altar and parts were given to the Kohanim priests. Fourth, the different types of sin offerings, chatas, brought to atone for transgressions committed erroneously by the high priest, the entire community, the king, or the ordinary Jew. And finally, 5, the guilt offering, asham, brought by one who misappropriated property of the sanctuary, who was in doubt as to whether they transgressed a divine prohibition, or who committed a betrayal against Hashem by swearing falsely to defraud a fellow human. Many details of all these sacrifices are discussed in this week's Torah portion, and really in the bulk of the book of Leviticus, hence its name, Leviticus, and the Levitical laws, the laws pertaining to the priests, to the Levites, and to the sanctuary. So we're not going to focus on these details. We're going to be analyzing something which is really begins in this week's Torah portion, but is applicable for all of not just Leviticus, but for the rest of the Torah portions, the prophets, and so on, the times of the temple. We celebrate things for various reasons. We celebrate various milestones, graduations, year ends, tremendous milestones, right? Retirement is a milestone for celebration, some may say. Or maybe it just marks the beginning, the end of one era and the beginning of another era. There are various celebrations which are done at various times. And the question is, what are milestones or achievements within Judaism that's cause for celebration? Do we relish our Judaism enough that we feel that when we conclude a specific chapter, when we reach a specific milestone, it's worthwhile to celebrate with a similar style party, with a joyous occasion, with a party inviting friends and families over? And in today's lesson, we're going to explore that exact idea, when or what type or how or if these types of celebrations for Judaism and for Jewish rituals and studies and so on, how they're practiced. I'll begin with a very simple, straightforward text, text 1a. If you have the books, it's on page 153. The Torah portion in verse 7 of this week's Torah portion, the descendants of Aaron the Kohen shall place fire on the altar and arrange wood on the fire. Seemingly technical, but very important. Arranging wood on the fire. There were many, many sacrifices in the temple, but there was one aspect of the temple which seems to be technical. It's technicality, it's a preparatory step, but it does take tremendous importance, and that is the wood on top of the altar. The altar was a stone structure, and the tabernacle was made from copper. Once they arrived in Israel, it was made from stone, and it had earth mixed into it. And atop the altar was wood in order to burn, to make a fire, to burn the various sacrifices. These ideas, this idea of the wood wasn't just a side point, a preparatory point, but it was actually part and parcel of the service in the temple. So much so, in the words of Maimonides, we see it's actually part of the order of the day. There was one of the priests who was given that holy work to prepare the wood for the temple. In the words of Maimonides, this is the schedule of the service for the fixed daily offerings. Shortly before dawn, the supervisor knocks on the gates of the temple courtyard, and they are open for him. And it goes on to continue various steps of the morning process in the temple. Then the person chosen for this role arranges the large pile of wood on the altar, followed by the second pile, and then he brings up 2 additional logs of wood and places them on the large pile to increase the fire. It's quite important, this idea of the wood. Not only is it important that it takes an important space in the schedule of the day, but actually in the temple compound, there was a room that was 40 cubits squared. A cubit is roughly 22 inches, 2 feet, somewhere between 18 and 22 inches. 40 cubits squared was this room that was set aside for the wood and the processing of the wood. So the wood didn't only take up a space in the schedule, but it also took up space in the actual temple compound. As we see in the Mishnah, text 2, the courtyard of the temple had 4 unroofed chambers in its 4 corners, each of which was 40 cubits squared, quite large. The chamber in the northeastern corner was the wood chamber. Priests who were unable to participate in the temple work itself, if they were blemished, and so on, would work in this chamber inspecting the wood for worms. Any piece that had worms was unfit for the use of the altar. It was a painstaking service. They had to go through every single piece of wood and make sure it was befitting the temple. It was a clean piece, there was no worms, it wasn't infested, and only then was it able to go on the altar. So the wood takes quite an important place in the temple. It wasn't like they had a shed outside the temple. Temple courtyard was actually part of the temple. It was part of the actual structure, and it wasn't a courtyard out of Temple Mount. And it took an important space in the schedule. So we find that the wood was pretty important, but it goes even deeper than that. The Talmud relates, the Mishnah actually relates in great detail that there were various families that were given the privilege, the honor to supply the temple with wood. It wasn't that the temple just went out and got wood. It was actually a distinct honor and privilege for someone to supply the wood. And the Mishnah then relates that there were 9 families that had this distinct privilege. And it lists the 9 families and the day that they would bring the wood. They would bring the wood on the 1st of Nisan. They would bring the wood various intervals throughout the year. 9 times throughout the years, these 9 families had a set time that they were privileged to supply the temple with the wood. Why these 9 families? So the Talmud relates, these 9 families were very special. It was shortly after the Babylonian exile, and the Jewish people returned to Israel, and there was no wood. There was no wood. There was no wood to be found for the temple. These 9 families came forward and gave from their own supply of wood for the temple. They were willing to give up their wood for the supply for the temple at that time when there was a shortage. And so because they came forward at a time that no one else did, the sages instituted that these 9 families will always have the privilege for eternity to supply the temple with wood, even at a time when the temple is able to buy wood on its own, even when there is no shortage, even when there are thousands of people who want to bring wood to the temple. Nope, these 9 families are privileged with bringing the wood. And what would happen on the day that they would bring the wood? The Talmud relates that the day that these 9 families would bring the wood, for the entire family, it was a holiday. It was a holiday just like Yom Kippur and just like Sukkot. It was a tremendous holiday for these extended families, not just for the 2-3 individuals that would be driving the truck. I mean, they didn't have trucks those days, but not for the 2-3 individuals that were schlepping the horse and buggy up the mountain with the logs of wood. For the entire extended family, you have to imagine 200-300 years into the second temple, the family must have numbered thousands of people. And so these families celebrated a tremendous holiday. Thousands of people, 9 times throughout the year. It was a tremendous holiday. And it's a little long. We'll skip to text 5a, page 157. And it was called the Day of the Wood Sacrifice. What was the Day of the Wood Sacrifice, explains Maimonides? certain families had a fixed time on which they would go out to the forest and bring wood for the pile on the altar. On the day designated for each particular family to bring their wood sacrifice, they would also bring voluntary burnt animal sacrifices. This occasion was called the Day of the Wood Sacrifice, and it was celebrated as a festival for the family bringing the wood. On this day, the family was forbidden to deliver mournful eulogies for the deceased or fast, and they were also not allowed to perform work on this day. This was the custom. It was a great holiday. It was similar to Purim, to Hanukkah. It was a holiday. It was a time to rejoice. It was a time to have a festive meal. It was a time not to be sad. There was no tachnun. There was no of the supplication prayers said, and so on and so forth. It was a tremendous holiday for these families. But you'll notice something unique in this text. It doesn't just call it the day that they would bring the wood. What was the day of the wood sacrifice? It's as if the wood itself is not just a preparatory stage. The wood is so important. It's a sacrifice. It's called a sacrifice. And it wasn't just these 9 families. By and large, the wood came from these 9 families. But if an individual wanted to bring some wood for his own sacrifice, or to have part of that honor of supplying the temple with wood, an individual was able to bring some wood. And so Maimonides continues, even a private individual who donated wood or logs for the pile on the altar is forbidden to deliver mournful eulogies for the deceased or to fast, and is also not allowed to perform work on this day. This was the custom. Even an individual, it became an individual holiday. Yom Purim is a holiday for everyone. We don't go to work. One isn't supposed to work on the holiday of Purim. We'll discuss that a little later next week, and various other details of Purim. Hanukkah, it's more than Hanukkah because we're permitted to work on Hanukkah. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, we're not permitted to work. This was a holiday. It took such an important place in Jewish life associated with the temple. The wood wasn't just another step, another technicality associated with the temple. It was quite important. That day was a holiday. But the holiday associated with the wood donations and with the wood in general of the temple goes even further. Some of you may have heard of the 15th of Av. The 15th of Av was a day set aside in temple times for matchmaking, for Jewish matchmaking. And until today, we celebrate the 15th of Av, which is in the summer. It's 6 days after the 9th of Av. We still celebrate the 15th of Av as a minor holiday. It's a minor of the minor holidays, but it's still a holiday nonetheless. To us, it may seem as a minor holiday in the way we celebrate it, but in the temple times, and the way the Talmud says that there were no greater holidays than this day and then Yom Kippur. And why was this holiday so great? So we're all familiar, or we may have discussed various times, one of the reasons that the Talmud explains. Text 6. Why is the 15th of Av a holiday? So the Talmud relates, on the 15th of Av, the Jewish girls would go out and dance in the vineyards, and single men would come to find a wife. A Tannaitic scholar taught, one who did not have a wife would turn to there to find one. The sages taught about the details of this practice. The beautiful girls would say, young men, pay attention to beauty because a wife is primarily for her beauty. The girls of distinguished lineage would say, pay attention to the family because a wife is primarily for children. The simple girls that lack beauty and distinguished lineage would say, make your choice based on holy considerations out of fear of heaven, and after marriage you will adorn us with gold jewelry. And we're not going to get into the details of this. There's much to be discussed. This is only part of the Talmudic passage. But suffice it to say that it was a beautiful custom, beautiful scene. It was something very special, and it was really the matchmaking day for the Jewish people. But the Talmud takes it a step further. And the Talmud says that's not the main reason for why the 15th of Av was a special holiday. You know what the main reason for this holiday is? Because on the 15th of Av, they would stop chopping wood for the temple. It was a holiday. Why? Why was it a holiday? Because they stopped chopping wood. It's kind of really, really technical. And B, why'd they stop chopping wood? They didn't need wood a month later. They didn't need wood 2 months later. Why did they stop chopping wood on the 15th of Av? So the Talmud explains, doesn't leave anything unturned. Text 7. The 15th of Av was the day on which they ceased cutting trees for the wood on the altar. As Rabbi Eliezer the Great taught, following the 15th of Av, the sun's strength wanes. So they would stop cutting trees from the altar because the wood wouldn't be sufficiently dry, providing an inviting habitat for worm infestation. So like we explained in the beginning, the wood had to be checked to ensure that there was no worms. The wetter the wood is, the more worms there's going to be. It becomes an inviting habitat. We all know from our homes, from our gates outside, etc. So they had to make sure that the wood was really, really dry. Any wood that was chopped after the 15th of Av wouldn't be able to sufficiently dry outside, wouldn't be able to sufficiently dry to the extent that it would be totally dry in time, and it would draw a worm infestation. So the 15th of Av was the day they stopped chopping wood, and it was made into a holiday. And that holiday had a unique name. Rabbi Menashe said they therefore called this day the day of breaking the axes. Right? They didn't need the axes anymore to chop the wood, so they break the axe as they were no longer necessary for the season. So the Talmud relates that this was a holiday, it was a special day. The 15th of Av was a special day. What's the main reason why it's a special day? What's the main reason why it's a holiday? The Talmud tells us, because it was the day that they stopped chopping wood, and it would be called the day that they broke the axes. What's the great joy? What's the great celebration? Why the breaking of the axes, and why is that entire day called the day of the breaking of the axes? As if it's a cause for celebration. What's the cause for celebration? So we're going to analyze the cause for celebration on two levels. Superficial, technical aspect of why the cause for celebration. And then we're going to dig a little deeper to understand one aspect associated with this specific day, the day of the breaking of the axes. What's the technical reason? What are they celebrating on the 15th of Av that they stopped chopping the wood? Text 8, a great 14th century sage, Rabbi Yosef ibn Chabiba, is a great Spanish sage, and he writes as follows, explaining the Talmudic passage and the custom of temple era of celebrating that day. The 15th of Av was celebrated as a joyous festival because on this day they would complete and conclude the mitzvah of the wood donation. They've reached this milestone. They were performing this mitzvah. They've concluded this mitzvah. It's a time for celebration. It's a cause for joy. It's like the graduation. It's like reaching a milestone. It's like a firm that manages to seal a deal. It's like a company that sells their millionth product. They've reached a milestone. They've reached the goal. They've concluded the mitzvah. It's a time for celebration. Says Rabbi Yosef ibn Chabiba, it is customary to make a festive day with a celebratory meal when one completes any mitzvah. The celebration of the 15th of Av wasn't similar to the celebration that the individual would have when he would bring wood. It wasn't similar to the celebration that was done by a family, however large that family was, because that was the day that they had this privilege of supplying the wood for the temple. The celebration of the 15th of Av related to the wood was because they've concluded a mitzvah. They've completed the performance of a mitzvah. They've reached that point that they've chopped the wood for the altar. And when we complete a mitzvah, it's a cause for a celebration. The great halachist, the Marshal, Rabbi Shlomo Luria, explains as follows, text 9. Goes into great detail in halacha, how one should celebrate. When a Jew completes the study of a section of the Torah, they should give praise and thanks to Hashem and publicize their celebration of completion. As can be derived from the Talmud, where it states that the Jewish people had no greater festivals than Yom Kippur and the 15th of Av, and the Talmud gives various reasons for the festive nature of the 15th of Av until it concludes with the reason that this was the final day of cutting wood for the altar. In other words, since they completed a great mitzvah on that day, they would celebrate it as a festival. There can be no greater mitzvah than the completion of a section of Torah. This is especially true when one's intention is to immediately begin the study of another section of Torah. Even other people who did not complete the section themselves share this great mitzvah to join in the celebration of a person who has completed the study. Of course, it was a joyous occasion. They completed the mitzvah. They've completed this tremendous mitzvah of chopping wood. When we complete a mitzvah, it's a cause for joy. When we study Torah, it's a cause for joy. When we complete an aspect of study. We do it every year, Simchat Torah, the joy of the Torah. We concluded the year of the study of Torah. And what's the joy? The joy isn't just that I've concluded the Torah. The joy is that we're beginning the Torah anew immediately. The joy isn't only that I've concluded the Torah if I haven't even concluded the Torah, but the joy is that we as the Jewish people have concluded the Torah. So too over here. I may have not chopped any wood. I may have not been planning on chopping any wood. But the wood chopping has ended. They've completed a mitzvah. It's a time for joy. We've reached a milestone. So we got it. Technically, the reason why they had a celebration was because they've concluded a mitzvah. But really, it's cause for such celebration? I mean, it's just cutting wood. Not only is it just cutting wood, which is a preparatory stage for the mitzvah, which is the sacrifices, and it's the wood for the fire, and it's the cutting of the wood. And the cutting the wood wasn't even brought yet to the temple. They had to wait until those families would take this wood that was chopped for the temple and bring it to the temple. Granted, it's a celebration, there's a completion of something. But really, it's the greatest holiday. It's such a great day, the 15th of Av, that the Talmud relates it as the greatest holiday. There were no more joyous days than the 15th of Av. Why is it cause for such great celebration? And perhaps even more perplexing is the name of the day. The 15th of Av, we know it as the 15th of Av, but the Talmud relates that it was called the day of the breaking of the axe. Is the breaking of the axe that important that this most joyous day on the calendar receives this peculiar name, the day of the breaking of the axe? Something's amiss here. So in order to understand this, let's take a step back. What day on the calendar did this holiday take place? On the 15th of Av. What else is the month of Av famous for or infamous? Not only famous for, but the Talmud actually relates that when Av arrives, the month of Av arrives, we should reduce in our joy, in our celebrations. Take a step back, lower the notch a little, turn the volume down. What's it famous for? It's famous for the 9th of Av. The 9th of Av, just 6 days earlier, 6 days before this celebration takes place, is a day that we commemorate many calamities that befell the Jewish people. The destruction of the first temple, the destruction of the second temple, the time when God decreed that the Jewish people will wander in the desert for 40 years. It was a day that's set aside for Jewish calamities and tragedies. It's not a coincidence that these 2 days are in close proximity and that the 15th of Av follows the 9th of Av. Nothing is a coincidence. On the contrary, the joyous events that take place on the 15th of Av symbolize the antidote to and the healing for the mournful occurrences of the 9th of Av. And the Rebbe takes a deeper look at the way they're presented in the Talmud to underscore this connection between the 2 days. Text 10a. The teaching that the Jewish people had no greater festivals than Yom Kippur and the 15th of Av appears immediately after the Mishnah's discussion of the 9th of Av, the greatest day of mourning of the year. It is in direct continuation from this that the Mishnah concludes on a positive note with the opposite extreme. The Jewish people had no greater festivals than Yom Kippur and the 15th of Av. The link between these two is not just that one's the antidote to the other. The reason why the 15th of Av is such a great celebration is because it comes immediately following the 9th of Av. That's why it's particularly joyous. And that's why the Talmud underscores that the main reason, the primary reason for the celebration of the 15th of Av was associated with the chopping of the wood. Because the chopping of the wood is an event that is directly associated with the temple, whose destruction is the main reason for the mourning on the 9th of Av. What makes the wood chopping the antidote for the temple's destruction? How is the final day of chopping wood the response to the temple's destruction? Okay, it's associated. Granted, the wood is for the temple was destroyed, all right, we got both the name of temple in there. But what does it mean when we say that the chopping wood ceremony, this wood chopping ceremony and the breaking of the axes is kind of the silver bullet for the destroyed temple grief? So we'll understand that by highlighting an interesting law for Maimonides, and I hope you're still with me here. Why is the wood chopping the antidote to the grief of the temple destruction? Which is why the 15th of Av is so joyous following the terrible grief of the 9th of Av. Says Maimonides, it is a positive commandment to build a house for Hashem in which the sacrifices will be offered. The essence of the temple, says Maimonides, is the fact that there is an altar that we bring sacrifices on. What's so unique about the sacrifices? That it defines what the temple is. It's the essence of the temple, is this altar which brings the sacrifices. The sacrifices are very unique. And we see that in a law pertaining to the building of the altar. Text 12. The stones that formed the ramp leading up to the altar, as well as the stones of the altar itself, were all sourced from the valley of Beit Keren. They dug into virgin soil and extracted whole stones on which no iron had been applied. Here's the key. Since iron disqualifies materials for the altar by its very touch. The reason for this is that iron serves the purpose of shortening life, whereas the purpose of the altar is to extend people's lives. It is therefore inappropriate to use material that shortens life on a structure that extends life. The sacrifices that were brought in the temple was to bring atonement for whoever brings them, extending their life. Iron, however, is a material which is used for death and destruction, which shortens people's life through war, through violence. Therefore, says the Mishnah, it is inappropriate to use iron on the temple, and the stones had to be stones that were never touched with iron. If so, how were the stones cut? The Talmud relates that there was a special worm called a shamir that was able to chew through stone, and they place it in a special manner that it'll cut the stone to the shape and size with the correct areas that they needed. Iron is something which represents evil. Iron is something which represents shortening life. An axe made from iron that chops wood is something that shortens lives. Begrudgingly, we use it because you got to chop wood for the temple. And so it's used for a holy purpose, for the purpose of chopping wood. The moment we no longer need to chop wood, it's the 15th of Av, the sun is waning, its strength is waning. We're not going to be chopping wood any longer. And if we're not going to be chopping wood any longer, now all that is left with this axe, it's representative of shortening life. If it's representative of shortening life, we ought to destroy it because the 15th of Av is connected with what? With the temple. The 9th of Av is a day that we mourn the destruction of the temple. We mourn the destruction of the altar, which lengthens people's lives. And on the 15th of Av, we celebrate the rebirth, we celebrate the strengthening of people's lives through destroying the axe, the symbol of iron, which symbolizes shortening life. It's the perfect antidote to the 9th of Av. It's the celebration of life that the altar affords us. It's a celebration of lengthening of life, of God accepting our atonement and forgiving us and granting us longer life. What greater joy is there than this idea of expressing the beauty of the temple, of the altar, of the lengthening of one's life? In the words of the Rebbe, text 13, page 166, the special event on the 15th of Av, on which day they ceased cutting trees for the wood on the altar, speaks to the very purpose of the building of the temple, the altar, and the sacrifices. The purpose of the altar as a place intended to extend people's lives by bringing sacrifices on it was expressed by the event of the conclusion of the wood chopping. The act of breaking the axes that was done on the 15th of Av was the breaking of the counterweight to the altar, the iron that shortens lives. This is why the iron axes were broken in the literal sense. From that point on, they no longer served the useful purpose of cutting the wood for the altar, and all that remained was their destructive nature that shortens people's lives. It was therefore proper to break them. This, then, is the reason why the 15th of Av was celebrated with such joy, and the cause for celebration was something that seemed so technical, the completion of chopping of wood for that year, celebrated by this seemingly insignificant ritual of breaking of the axes. But the important symbolism of the breaking of the axes, which explains everything, because it's following the 9th of Av, which symbolizes the destruction of the temple, where we commemorate the destruction of the temple, the destruction of the altar, which lengthens one's life. Now comes the 15th of Av, which symbolizes the building of the temple and the ridding of the iron, which is a symbol of destructiveness, and getting rid of it, symbolizing the constructive purpose of the temple of lengthening one's life. Perhaps one takeaway that we can take from this idea is the technical aspect of the 15th of Av. And that is, as we mentioned in the beginning, the idea that on the very technical level, the celebration was the completion of a mitzvah. It's actually stated so in the Code of Jewish Law. Text 14, when one concludes the study of a section of the Torah, it is a mitzvah to celebrate. It's a mitzvah. So when you study at home and you're studying some Torah at home, and you have a daily study regimen, or you're reading a book of Torah insights by a rabbi, or a book of Torah studies by the Rebbe, or a book of letters from the Rebbe, or a book of the Talmud, or whatever book you may be reading, a Torah book. When you finish that book, throw a party. It's a mitzvah. You throw a party for various milestones. You may not throw a party for the conclusion of the latest novel that you read. You may not throw a party for the conclusion of the latest self-help book. But when it comes to a book of Torah, it is absolutely a reason for a party. It's a cause for celebration. The conclusion of a book of Torah is a cause for celebration, A, because you've reached this milestone and you've completed this mitzvah of studying this Torah book, but B, because it's going to propel you to go ahead and start studying another book, and it will encourage others seeing the joy and celebration that you have with this Torah study. As a matter of fact, we're used to the Torah study that takes place and the celebrations that take place every year on Simchas Torah. But here's another example of a celebration, an annual celebration. The Rebbe instituted in 1984 the study of Maimonides, where we study the magnum opus of Maimonides, is 14-volume halachic work codifying Jewish law. There's, if I'm not mistaken, 83 sections of laws, thousands upon thousands of laws, but roughly about 1,000 chapters, give or take. 900 chapters, 950. The study cycle is about a year, 11 and a half months, because if you study 3 chapters a day, you conclude about 900 chapters in just under a year. And so every year there's this tremendous celebration. In 1986, there was a huge celebration, quite publicly so. And the following is an excerpt from the New York Times, the day after the celebration. Can you imagine in 1985 a child pushing to go to such an event, said Mrs. Ruchama Clapman, standing in the grand ballroom of the Marriott Marquis Hotel, where more than 8,000 Jews had gathered to celebrate a year-long study of the works of Maimonides. But after learning all about this in school and hearing his father and his grandfather talking about it at home, he didn't sleep all night because he was afraid we wouldn't get here on time. The article continues, the Lubavitchers were joined in their studies by members of other Jewish groups, among them the Gers, the Bluzhevers, the Belzes, and the Bubivs, and they all gathered yesterday for the second celebration of the culmination of their studies and the beginning of another year of learning, a practice they intend to continue annually, and indeed it continues till this day. As her students celebrated their studies through music and cheers, Mrs. Lane listened to Rabbi Pekarsky begin the study process anew by reading the first passage from the Mishnah Torah. The foundation of all foundations and the pillar of all wisdoms is to know that there is a first being who brings every existing thing into being. In a year, Mrs. Lane said, she will be back to celebrate another cycle completed and still another to come. Conclusion of an area of Torah. Conclusion of a mitzvah. Celebrating the completion of a mitzvah is a mitzvah in and of itself, and we ought to do it more often, at least as often as we celebrate other accomplishments and other milestones. So let's start partying. Let's start partying more often. Let's start studying Torah more often, and let's start partying more often, celebrating the completions of Torah study and mitzvahs and the beginning of them once again.